Welcome to the Real News. I'm Eddie Conway, coming to you from Baltimore. We have been listening to a lot of social media chatter about why people are rioting, and we thought we would have a discussion and a conversation about why do people riot. And so joining me today for this discussion is Jacqueline Luqman. Jackie, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for wanting to have the discussion with me, Eddie.
You know, first, I think I want to share a personal story and a personal experience about riots. I was in Europe in 1967 in Germany. I had been over there for about 2.5 years. I was in the Army. I was getting ready to go to Vietnam. I had signed a re-enlistment paperwork, and we was working through the process of what was going to happen and how it was going to take place. And one morning, I woke up and I looked at the Stars and Stripes, and on the front of the newspaper was this picture of a riot in Newark, New Jersey. And in the picture, there were 20 to 30 Black women on the corner protesting, and you could see them, they were yelling, their hands was in the air, and they were very angry. And in the center of the street, where both streets cross, was an armored personnel carrier with a 50 caliber machine gun, a belt of bullets running through it, and a white soldier sitting behind the gun with his thumbs an inch away from the triggers. And this gun, it's an automatic weapon. If you press both triggers, it will automatically go off and shoot 25 to 50 rounds. You get caught up in it, the momentum of it, like an electrical shock. You can't get your hands off of it. And I realized that, well, if he sneezed or if he pressed those triggers, all those women on the corner would have been killed. And they would have been cut in half, and the building would have had a building that they were standing in front of would have had a huge hole in it. That's how powerful those rounds are. And I had to ask myself, what's going on? And I realized Newark, New Jersey, my mother is in Baltimore. My mother could have very well been on that corner. This could have been happening a few miles to the south. And I had to question, why was I getting ready to go to Vietnam and fight to make the world safe for democracy when there was real serious problems in the Black community? And I'm sharing this story because when people talk about riots, they don't realize that when people are so desperate that they riot, it's a cry to be heard. And that cry, in most cases, are heard all around the world. And for me, I was like 6,000 miles away in Europe, and I heard that cry and decided not to go to Vietnam.
Wow.
But Jackie, what are some of the people saying about this rioting that's going on now? I think it's in like 7 major cities. And what's your take on it?
Well, I mean, I really, that's really an amazing story, Eddie, because that reflects a real life connection with what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said when he said that the absolute guarantor against riots was social justice. And he went on to say that a riot is the language of the unheard. And, you know, people are hearing right now, like those very cries of oppressed people still. This is still why we're having uprisings and rebellions in these cities across the country. And I think they're just going to grow because people have not been heard about the very things that King was talking about in 1963, and the very things that people were rising up against in cities like Newark, New Jersey in 1967. And the issue, one of the issues is police brutality and police terror against civilians, against citizens. So, you know, when we bring these issues up again and again, Eddie, people always come with these crazy, well, maybe they're not crazy, right? Because people really believe the things they say. They believe the deflections that they give, but they don't really want to have a conversation about what's really going on that led to these uprisings. So, I mean, for me, when people respond to this obvious pain and frustration. So yeah, Eddie, when I hear people say, you know, why are they destroying their own neighborhoods? Yeah, that just is the first indication for me that people still aren't listening to anything people who live in these neighborhoods have said about how they're treated in their neighborhoods, particularly by the police.
You would think, you know, with the Ghana case in New York, the Mike Brown case, the Tyrone case, the Kareem Gaines case. I mean, there's just thousands of cases. You would think by now that people would understand that this is a systemic problem. In this particular case, in the officer that pinned this brother down had 18 complaints against him. Right. 18 different people had went and said that this person uses excessive force and is destructive to the community, and no one heard it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, what are people supposed to do after that?
Right. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, not only do people in Minneapolis, the political structure, not listen to the demands for justice from these people, and these aren't, you know, just like frivolous things like, oh, this cop isn't nice to me. No, these were instances of this cop having actually shot other people, having killed another person. And at the time in 2009 or so, Amy Klobuchar was the top prosecutor, and she refused to prosecute at least a dozen cops who had various police brutality charges against them. She refused to prosecute them. So when people follow the rules, they go through the process, they ask for justice in the way that they're supposed to, along all the proper channels, and murderers still go free, to not only not face any kind of justice, but to also continue to do the job of so-called policing people, which only gives them the opportunity to abuse more people. I don't know what people think that folks are supposed to do with that. I'm kind of at a loss for how people think that somehow people are just supposed to, you know, take that and be like, okay, well, we're just going to have to deal with seeing this murderer on the street every day, harassing us, and maybe we're next and that's going to be okay.
You know, as you were talking, I was thinking about Ferguson, and after Ferguson, there was a federal investigation. Mm-hmm. They evaluated the police department there, and what they found was that excessive ticket traffic violations were being handed out to the Black community. The Black community was being harassed constantly, daily, and part of the outcome of that harassment was all of those monies were going to help prop up the police department. Similar thing happened here after Freddie Gray in Baltimore. The federal government came in, they looked at things. They set up a consent decree. But what they determined was every single day, the police department were violating the rights of Black people in the city, every single day, on all levels, on all scales, from just verbal abuse to death.
Mm-hmm.
So now what happens if you go through all these processes and no one hears you? Then what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to respect the government in that community, or are you supposed to respect the people that own property in that community, when in fact you don't own any property? In most cases, most of these things happen, although I look at Henry Gates and realize that they don't always happen in the lower economic class communities. They happen all over. If you got a PhD and you're Black, you still a subject
still a
to
target.
be a kill. So how do you deal with it?
Right. And I mean, the thing is, and I'm thinking, Eddie, about these stay at home or the anti-lockdown protests, right? Now, these people were mad because they claimed they wanted businesses open, and they got so angry that they're out in the streets, fully armed, up in police officers' faces, storming the state house, blocking the entrances to hospitals, harassing nurses and doctors who are out counter-protesting against them, trying to stand up for people who are infected with this virus and in those hospitals dying. These people are mad because they couldn't get a haircut and, you know, couldn't go out and have a beer at a bar. And that's perfectly reasonable for a lot of people. People are like, well, they're just standing up for their freedom. But somehow people can't make the connection between people who live under just unconscionable police oppression every day, and somehow that people can't understand why at some point those folks are going to act out as well. They're going to act out in frustration and anger and rage as well. But the response to those folks vastly different than the response to the so-called patriots who are standing up for their freedom, protesting some lockdowns.
You know, I was looking at the Twitter stuff that's going on now with Trump using a statement from that mayor in Miami during the riot in '67 that says that if there's looting, there'll be shooting or something similar to that. And I was noticing that during some of those protests last night, at least 7 people were shot.
Here we go. Here we go.
Looks like more police coming up.
No one knows right now who the shooter is. And of course, the police are probably not trying to determine that. But it's interesting, and it's also dangerous that Trump would call for shooting people, and then that night, people would get shot as a result of a protest. What do you think about that, Jackie?
Well, listen, you and I have been around long enough, Eddie, to understand that there is such a thing as agent provocateurs who will infiltrate all kinds of movements to discredit them, whether they are organizations or protests, so-called peaceful protests. And I don't think that's something that we can discount. I think you and I, of course, we're not going to discount that because we've seen too much. We've seen too much of it. And there is video, at least out of Minneapolis, of one such questionable person. Now, we don't know who this person is. Person hasn't been identified, but some person casually just breaking the windows of a store, the AutoZone there in Minneapolis, and the citizens, the residents are asking this guy, what are you doing? Well, stop. That's not, stop that. He's just going along about his business. So I think that there is a very real possibility that some of this provocation is done by agents. I really believe that's true. Only because historically that's always been true. And I don't think there's ever been a case of uprising that our people and our brothers and sisters who are indigenous and Latino who haven't experienced agents in our midst. So that's definitely something we have to be really, really careful of. But you know what, Eddie, I'm so glad you did raise the point a little bit earlier that, you know, in this conversation about, oh, why do people destroy their own neighborhoods? People aren't destroying our neighborhoods. That we don't own anything in these places. We're not talking about people burning down like apartment buildings where people live in, homes where people live in. What we're really talking about is property damage, like commercial property damage. And that definitely sends a message that people are more concerned about broken windows and a burned down construction site than they are about decades and centuries of police abuse of people. I think that's an incredibly striking part of this whole conversation that just annoys me, but that I believe people get, but that's how ingrained they are into aligning with capitalism over standing up for justice for people.
Yeah, you know, and I think probably one of the pieces that's always missing out of this is the research that the Malcolm X grassroots movement did. They looked back to 1900 and they looked through that whole 20th century up into the 21st century. And they determined from Ida B. Wells research and other research that a person of color is killed in America every 12 hours by law enforcement, correctional officers, or security personnel. One person every 12 hours. And if that was happening in the white community, or if that was happening in the Jewish community, if that was happening anywhere else, there would be an overthrow of the government. Now, and so, but yet people that see that they are being targeted and killed because of the color of their skin don't have a voice, and when they complain, it falls on deaf ears. And there seems to be, and I'm certainly not a supporter of rides, because I think people probably need to organize themselves to protect themselves. But I certainly understand that rides is going to result from too much abuse. In fact, that's what the Declaration of Independence says. You know, after a long train of abuses, when do you call for a break with this kind of behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you brought up the point about the Declaration of Independence, because really, at this point in the history of this country, if it's not clear to people that the Declaration of Independence doesn't apply to some people, doesn't apply to us, was never intended to apply to us, then I don't know what else to tell people. Like when people, you know, say things like, you know, oh well, when an uprising happens, well, you know, this is why the cops abuse you. No, people have it backward. People have it absolutely backward. The police, law enforcement, and that includes campus police, that includes security officers, that includes what do they call them? School resource officers. That school resource officers are nothing but cops in public schools. That's all they are. All of them, they are abusive towards certain people because that's the nature of policing. And it is unaddressed police abuse along with unaddressed economic and social and racial oppression that leads to riots. The police don't abuse us because we rise up against nothing. You know, this is years and decades and centuries of abuse that has been documented, as you said, Eddie, that all the evidence is there for someone in authority to do something about this abuse, but no one in authority ever does. And as Dr. King said, social justice is the absolute guarantor against riots. If you don't like riots, then do social justice. Make sure that justice is served and that society is equal. Don't do that, you will always have riots at some point. But you know what I want to add, Eddie, this whole notion of how so much of white America and too much of a segment of Black America really does love law enforcement. And I'm wondering if you can kind of help us parse through this response that people always have when there's one of these videos that come out of the police killing someone on camera, and people are always saying, well, we don't have all the information, you know, and maybe the cop was right, or we don't know what the person did. My feeling is that the police abuse people because they know they have the power of the police union behind them to pay their legal fees and defend them against prosecution and all that. But they also know that most citizens, especially most white people, are really going to support them regardless of what they do. And I'm wondering what you're thinking about that and where you think that comes from.
Well, for me, it's obvious. It comes from the way the economic system is set up in America. The capitalist system is set up and designed to protect property. Property is more important than human life. And most of the laws are about protecting property. The more property you own, the more protection you get. The law enforcement agencies know that. They get their money, donations, et cetera, from people with wealth. Here in Baltimore, say they are flying a spy plane that's been financed by a millionaire somewhere and given to them to carry out their mandate. And their mandate is to protect property and to protect the capitalist system. And so people outside of that system, people that's not benefiting from that system, they have serious grievance and they represent a serious threat because they're not part of that system. So they need to be controlled, they need to be maintained, and they need to be occupied. And so in most of these communities where you see things like this happening, is you can find out that Trump's son-in-law owns 300 or 400 pieces of that property, or other very wealthy people that's nowhere near. Some of them are in Australia, some of them are in France. They own this stuff and they use law enforcement to protect this stuff. Now, the sad thing is that there has been an inclusion of, and because we demanded it, we protest, we marched about it, and so now there's been an inclusion in law enforcement for Black officers, Black people, people of color. And of course, we thought that would make things better. We thought that would make the police more humane, that would understand the problems and the conditions that exist by allowing people that suffered under those same conditions there. But what we find is that uniform, that authority, the ability to determine whether somebody will live or die, That's the kind of power that corrupts the human spirit. And one of the things some years ago, decades maybe, back in the 70s, they did a study and they took a graduate class and they divided it up into two groups. They put one group in uniforms and they put another group in jumpsuits and made them prisoners. The experiment was supposed to take place for 7 days. And these are grad students. I mean,
Right.
they've got their bachelor's degrees, they're seeking their master's degrees, and they're studying what power does to people. They know this going in. They get in there around the third day, the uniform students are abusing the prison students. And around the fourth or fifth day, one of the students even hung himself. This is an experiment. They had to stop the experiment because what they determined is when you put all these buttons and badges and bells and whistles and give weapons and tear gas and billy clubs and tell people they're in charge, it gets into their psyche and they start behaving differently. And if they don't behave differently, they become an outcast within their group. In other words, if they're not joining the rest of their group and doing whatever they're doing and supporting abuse of the rest of the people, then they are ostracized and they're pushed on the side. And this is what happens. So now when people of color become engaged, involved in that kind of work or activity, they either have to join the ranks or they'll get pushed out of the ranks. And it's just, you know, all of these friendly fire, accidental shootings or unexplained suicides from officer this or that. This stuff happens all over. That's weeding out the people that's not gonna be part of this secret club.
So yeah, that experiment is called the Stanford Experiment. There have been countless studies done about that experiment. And there have been some pretty disturbing movies also. And it absolutely rings true to life, but it's also a part of the way regular citizens respond to law enforcement. And I think that comes from the way regular people, regular white people, were pretty much deputized by slave-holding states and some states in the North to be able to have the authority to detain Black people wherever they encountered them, demand their papers, and if they weren't satisfied, then they could turn them over to the slave patrols and send them back to enslavement, whether they were actually so-called runaway slaves or whether they were actually free people. So that gave your average person in this country this feeling of authority, like they were a part of this club, and you know, they had this authority over other people and they liked it, even if those folks were despised themselves by rich landowning slaveholders and were despised by the slave catchers. That sense of power over life and death, freedom and enslavement that people had over enslaved Black people or Black people in general was really, it did something to the psyche of Americans since then. And I think that has stuck around. And now you throw in capitalism, where some people believe that they are a part of the capitalist club. So they are supportive of law enforcement, protecting their property from the angry, unwashed hordes outside of the gates of their, you know, gated communities. This has been a long time coming, you know, these continued uprisings. But, you know, Eddie, one of the questions that I get stuck on, because this is so, and this is where I think people prove that they really don't care about the real history of this country. When people say things like, what if someone burned down your community, destroyed your community, stole from your house, destroyed your businesses? What if we did that to you? What would that solve? I mean, the history of this country and Black people in this country is rife with people doing exactly those things to us. So just in the last few minutes we have left, speak to how that's not foreign to us at all.
No, that's not. And the thing of it is that our businesses or businesses of people of color are not very welcome in wealthy communities or gated communities or communities that's exclusive. And if they were, or if they managed to get in, they would be burned down. Black Wall Street is not just a myth. That actually happened. 600 businesses got destroyed during the Red Summer, all throughout the Black communities across the country. There were attacks and rioting by white people and lynching, et cetera. And in fact, this went on all the way up to the end of World War II. And it is that behavior that we learned from, that our communities learned from. We didn't start rioting in other communities, and we didn't even riot in our own communities until after so many riots across the nation in our communities occurred. Eventually, young people say, well, I'm gonna do this too then. If this is the only thing that will get results, if this will only thing that will resolve the issue, then let's do this. And that's what happened. We've learned from the arrangement of oppression, from the arrangement of people being deputized or self-deputizing themselves. We've learned from that, and our young people and older people, for the want of any other way of having their voice heard, it's responding in kind now.
Yeah, I mean, we could go on because there's so much ridiculous stuff out there in response to the legitimate grievances of oppressed people. But I think we want to end with this. People will often say, well, that's not the way to do it. That's not how to protest. Listen, we have tried marching. We have tried singing. We've tried praying. We have tried kneeling. And this country has responded with hatred and dismissiveness to the grievances that we've tried to raise with all of those other means. We've tried voting, we've tried pleading and begging, and still our grievances were unheard. So here we are again in 2020, echoing the words of Dr. Martin Luther King once again, that a riot is the language of the unheard. That's why I call them rebellions and uprisings instead of riots, because at some point, the oppressed will have to rise up against our oppression.